In July 2012, an inspector at Quebec's Saint Louis de Blandford Strategic Reserve Warehouse uncovered a terrible truth. There had somehow been an undetected robbery. By the time an inventory and investigation was completed, they found that they were out over $18 million, making it the most expensive theft in all of Canadian history, even accounting for inflation. This sparked a years-long investigation, drawing international attention. Though the thieves were eventually caught, only about a quarter of the stolen property was ever recovered. The rest mostly circulated to an unknowing public. This heist has sparked political and legal uproar, a media frenzy, and even documentaries and a fictionalized adaptation. But the thieves didn't take money. They stole maple syrup. Welcome back to the Mightier Pen, where I share narrative tips for the story-driven DM. I'm Kate, an editor by trade, a writer by hobby, and a DM by default. Today we're stealing from history as we look at the robbery of the Canadian Maple Syrup Reserve. Heists are a staple of D&D, and for good reason. They provide players with a problem that often requires creativity in solving, the opportunity for hijinks, and plans that have to change and reassess at a moment's notice, or depending on the roll of a die. There are a lot of great resources for planning a heist, but one of the best sources of inspiration is to look at real-world robberies, some successful and some less so, to help you figure out how to create an interesting and challenging scenario for your table. First, let's look at the basic components of a heist by answering these three questions. What needs to be stolen? Why does it need to be stolen, and what stands between the characters and the item in question? Using the Canadian maple syrup heist, we're going to focus on that first point and how to really get creative with the goal your players have. The what of a heist is usually pretty straightforward, but I really encourage creative thinking in this aspect. The most common reason for a heist, whether by the party's own decision or because they were hired by someone else, is to gain money, either by stealing currency directly or by stealing something valuable to sell later. There are also, especially in fantasy settings, objects that are unique in function that can't be obtained in any other way. These are more stepping stones for a larger goal. Finally, the thing being stolen is sometimes a little more intangible, and the group can find themselves after information, whether by coaxing it out of a target or recovering it from a hidden location. It's important to examine worth and how you define it. What makes something valuable to the point that someone would be willing to steal it? There's monetary value, of course. That's what we usually see in media or even most news stories. But it's not always about the money. At least, not just money. Sometimes the value is more of a sentimental or personal kind, or a heist might be a stepping stone for a larger goal, something that needs to happen to accomplish something else. And sometimes it's about making a statement. Let's circle back to the maple syrup heist, which is possibly one of the oddest combinations of words I've ever had to say. Canada is far and away the largest producer of maple syrup in the world, with the province of Quebec alone accounting for roughly 70% of it. But production relies on a variety of factors that are out of the control of the farmers who toil to harvest the sap and boil it down. The flow of sap fluctuates, sometimes by a great deal because of things like temperature and weather, freeze cycles, moisture, and rain. Even changes in air pressure can cause sap flow to slow or increase. The price of maple syrup was wildly inconsistent as supply and demand constantly changed from year to year. The Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers, renamed the Quebec Maple Syrup Producers in 2018, is an organization that was formed in the 1950s and 60s as a way of uniting all those in Quebec who pursued the career of making and selling maple syrup. Their goal was to give support and stability to the highly unstable field. In 2000, that involved becoming the exclusive sales agent for bulk sales, and a few years later, implementing a strict quota system. By requiring farmers to contribute a certain amount of product each year outside of their sales, the Federation aimed to build up a reserve of maple syrup. In years when the supply was low, they could use product from the reserve to keep the market stable. I won't pretend to understand the nuances of the different sides, the politics and business practices that butt heads, but our story really begins in 2012 with a group of dissatisfied farmers. They felt the Federation had too much power and no reason to listen to the concerns of the individuals. But something that worked in their favor was that the amount of maple syrup in the reserve that the Federation kept was always changing. So while there were dedicated warehouses for maple syrup storage, the Federation occasionally had to find supplemental ones. Do you see where this is going? The group of people who robbed the maple syrup reserve were honestly only able to do so by chance. The reserve had been growing in recent years, and the Federation needed more space for it. So they rented out part of a warehouse that one of the thieves allegedly already had access to. The location was only sparsely guarded, and the thieves knew what precautions were in play. They were able to access it at will, taking barrels away with a rented forklift to drain them, replace the syrup inside with water, and return them. As time went on and their success grew, they either got overconfident or lazy or both. They started draining the barrels faster, not bothering to fill them with water afterwards. And one day, when an inspector leaned against a barrel, he was shocked when, empty and far lighter than it should have been, it fell over. The inspector called it into the Federation, and a full-scale investigation eventually revealed that over 3,000 tons of maple syrup had been siphoned away during 2011 and 2012, worth a combined total of over $18 million. While the thieves were able to profit off their stolen goods, selling to the black market, and yes, there's apparently a black market for maple syrup, who knew? A good deal of their motivation seems to be wrapped up in making a point, that the Federation's control reached too far and they would not stand for it. Because this is real life and not a story, there's not a tidy ending to this. It didn't seem to cause any sort of change in policy nor open up communication between the factions. There were several arrests made and people sentenced to jail time as the thieves did not make a clean getaway, one of them having signed his own name to rent the very specific and not widely available forklift used in their plans. That being said, it did inspire a TV series called The Sticky. So what can we learn from this robbery as we set up our own? In a game, of course, we are most certainly not planning real-world heists. 1. Don't be afraid to seem silly. Sure, on the surface, it seems absurd to think of there even being a national reserve of maple syrup, let alone that anyone would try to rob it, but for the people in that industry, it's the sort of thing that makes or breaks them. For small niche professions, a slight disruption can have significant impact. So while stealing from the maple syrup reserve sounds like a silly premise, it can still have high narrative impact. And you just know your players will have so much fun making jokes about it the whole time. 2. When most of us think of a high-stakes robbery, our minds go to high-value items. Gems and jewelry, rare artifacts, pieces of art, stashes of cash, things like that. Items that are widely known to be of high monetary value, easy to sell or trade. But don't be afraid to play around with more situationally dependent worth. Maybe something is sentimental to the mark that could be held for ransom. Maybe the person who hires your players needs something that is only important to a handful of people, but those handful of people guard it well. 3. Money is almost always the motive of any robbery, but it doesn't have to be just money, or even money in the pocket of the players. Let a robbery be a statement or part of a larger goal. If there's a war going on, then a robbery affecting the supplies or informational routes could turn the tide of battle one way or the other. If there's a tyrannical lord squeezing money out of his people, a robbery could inspire them to stand up against him. Just look at Robin Hood. Got your own take on planning heists? Share it in the comments. I'm Kate, and this has been The Mightier Pen. Keep honing those storytelling skills, and may your heists always be surprising.